Yo, what it did, yo? It's time to talk about an archetype that's always been a personal favorite of mine. Dot, damage over time. It's got this particular set of strengths and weaknesses that make it a really comfortable playstyle. Even if it's not always going to go to the moon in every variation, 'cause, we love our damage numbers going up. I promise you it's fine though, because these strengths that I'm talking about are so strong that it really talks about why it's always been such a strong league starter to play a dot centric play style. And it's always been the case, at least in my time playing PoE. I started back in Synthesis League 3.6. We are 19 leagues removed from then, and it's still dominant, right? So clearly it's on to something. And the core of this is really specifically that it's damage over time, like over time. Really fixate on that last two words, over time. And then there's a couple of other things that have, been added to the game historically to make it continue to scale well. And there's tons of different ways to apply dots to enemies, and therefore you can never really stamp out this archetype of scaling because, if one way to apply dot gets nerfed, another one might still be just fine. Now, before I start to talk about all that detail though, if you find this video useful, you like this type of video, liking the video lets me know that I should make more of it. And if you want to see more of what I do here on this channel, subscribe and maybe even click on the bell to know when I do actually post more. Now, let's get into it. Dots is a big category. It's a very big category because usually you'll hear dot and it's probably thinking about just the skill dots such as RF, Essence Drain, Vortex, Scorching Ray, maybe even the decay support, or the Deaths of Chess piece, but I'm also using this to talk about the strengths of the ailments as well: ignite, bleed, and poison. So all of the different ways of applying damage over time. And it's because they all have that one core strength: damage over time. I only need to hit X amount of times in order to do damage, right? For example, Vortex, I put a Vortex under the boss's feet. It's got a 3-second duration at base, which is pretty short, but you could scale that. But for 3 seconds, I don't actually have to touch the boss at all for it to take damage from my Vortex. And that's really strong. And now, Poison technically does not benefit as much from this, but that, again, we'll get to that. Right? But generally speaking, not needing 100% uptime to do your damage means that your damage in reality on a boss looks a lot closer to what you POB on than, say, a melee build, or even a bow build, or even a miner, right? A lot of builds endure downtime for one reason or the other. You just might not be able to face tank everything you see. And so instead, you just dump the damage over time on them. And then you run around like a headless chicken, perhaps. Or, you're dodging, you might be setting up debuffs, might be re-upping your buffs, whatever it may be. There's a lot of strength that comes from not needing to be 100% casting on the boss at all times in order to do damage. And that's what makes damage over time so strong. Now, we're going to talk about one of the strengths and weaknesses. This section right here is both at the same time, and it's how damage over time scales. Because there are limitations on it, but there are also very clear strengths as a result. Specifically, let's talk about skill dot first. So, again, Vortex, Essence Drain, those type of skills, the ones with the damage over time number on the gem. You cannot scale that damage with flat damage. If your wand says plus 100 to lightning damage to spells, it does not do shit to that Vortex ground dot, and that's fine. What it does scale very well with is levels, however. All of these versions, even Frostblades of Catabasis, has incredible level scaling. And so that's one of the big things. And then, usual things that work: elemental damage scaling if it's an elemental skill, chaos if it's a chaos skill. Damage over time multi is a specialized stat that was added for damage over time, which it's best to think of it as just a version of crit scaling. It doesn't actually require a crit chance. It's lower, obviously, than what you can do with crit multi, but that's kind of the idea. And it's also why there's a version for Perfect Agony to convert crit multi into dot multi. It's a whole thing, right? Now, one thing about scaling, and this actually is a thing that has kept certain versions of damage over time under control for sure, is that if the skill does not specifically state it, spell and attack damage modifiers do not apply to damage over time. Damage over time is in another category damage. Damage categories in this game are spell, attack, secondary, damage over time, basically. Like, there are things that literally say percent increased damage over time, which will apply to damage over time, such as Vortex. But Vortex also has the benefit of having the line, all modifiers to spell damage, affect this gem as well. Like this skill's damage over time effect as well. Not every version of spell dot has that. For example, Righteous Fire actually does not say that on it. And that's why I say skill dot instead of spell dot, by the way, to make it clear that not every skill actually scales that way. Or Frostblaze of Catabasis does not have a line for attack or spell damage actually scaling its ground dot. So that's a little bit of how we scale our skill dots. Now let's talk about ailments as well, just to understand that they both follow a similar set of rules, but a little different. Because ailments are not inherently flat heavy like on the gem, right? You don't look at a gem, say Viper Strike, and look at it and see a ridiculous amount of damage over time on it. You see that it is an attack that does damage based off of your weapon with some flat chaos on it. And it's got some conversion and all that good stuff on it. And so what ailments do is they check the base damage of the hit applying the ailment, which again, not affected by attack or spell modifiers. In fact, it's actually not scaled by any of the increases, not the base damage part anyways. The base damage is literally the base damage. So what does your weapon say? What does the skill gem say? What does the rest of your gear say for flat damage increases? That match the type of that ailment, right? Ignites only do fire, bleed only does physical, poison does physical and chaos, which you might be thinking, why does that do too? It's going to come up later why that does too, right? So it only checks the base value, and it doesn't matter if you increase or decrease that base value through percentages of more or less or increase or reduce, which is why deadly ailment support is so strong as a support specifically for ailment damage. The reduced hit damage has some downsides, but the reduced hit damage, my bad, not reduced, less hit damage does not actually impact the damage over time of the skill gem, or the gem it's supporting rather. Now, we're going to come back to some of these details in a moment, right? I just wanted to lay out the ground floor of where the scaling for these gems come from, because otherwise, ailments work very similarly to skill dot. Of course, there are lines on places that say, specific to poison, specific to bleed, specific to just spell damage over time, non-ailment DOT, like all of there's specification there. And general just PoE vocabulary moment. You get used to reading these things as you look around. Core of it is now that we've set the stage for why they can both be so strong early and then fall off so much unless you're poison. I'm just going to say it, unless you're poison. Okay, so now we need to talk a little bit about like ceiling potential, right? If we have limited the number of stats that can actually scale your build, right? You don't have the ridiculous volume of crit multi. You don't even necessarily always benefit from percent damage increases the same way that other archetypes of builds do. Or in the case of spell dot, you don't actually benefit from much on your weapon besides levels, percent generic damage types, and like damage over timelines. So there's a ceiling on where spell dot gets to. And that's what I say, like, you can't always take it to the moon. But the upside of this is that the base damages are so high that it makes progression content very easy. Not very easy in the sense that, like, oh yeah, you just slap on these dot skills and it just walks over the game. It's not exactly that simple, but it's pretty close, right? The simple existence of damage over time smooths over a lot of the work that you would have had to do in other capacities of your gearing. You can then focus on more defensive gearing, as well as damage over time. Let's loop back to that playstyle piece for a second. The playstyle of damage over time, not requiring you to constantly be attacking. Again, we're going to loop back to melee for a second. When you're playing in melee and then your totems are down, you have to put your totems back up. And that's time that you were spending no longer hitting the boss. When I put my dots on the enemy and then I realize my curse is down, my dots are still doing damage while I'm applying the curse, right? Or I'm refreshing the curse to make sure it doesn't fall off. I'm making sure my divine blessing is still rolling. I'm making sure that all of my dots are up, right? Now you're going to start to see the full picture come together. What you gain in quality of life and playability in damage over time archetypes, you lose in damage. And that's fine. That's supposed to be the trade-off. That's the intended trade-off. And this is across the board, even in Ignite and Bleed. Not as much in Poison, though. Because Poison stacks. That's the major difference between Poison and a lot of this other stuff. Everything else has a cap on its scale, on its stacking. Even something such as, say, Blight of Contagion or Blight, the base skill gem. Both of them have damage stacking caps, 5 of Blight on Contagion, 5 or 20 on Blight. When you hit that stacking limit, you no longer have a reason to continue hitting the target until the stacks fall off, because you're not doing anything extra to set target. Poison, however, its only cap is limited by the duration of the poisons themselves and your ability to hit the target. And so you can stack that up. Ignite has a cap of 1 unless you use Ember Wake to get a second. Bleed has a stack of 1 unless you use Crimson Dance in order to get up to 8. Generally speaking, that's what makes damage over time so fluid, is that you do 1 of every dot you have. So, if you're playing Bleed, it really is just the bleeds. Maybe you put on your Corrupting Fevers as well if you have enough generic phase scaling, or, if you're playing phase dot, Reap, Ixang, and CF, you make sure you have your 10 stacks of CF, your 3 stacks of Ixang, and your 1 stack of Reap, and then you're kind of chilling, right? Or if you're playing Cold Dot, it's what used to be get your Vortex, your Creeping Frost, and your Cold Snap under the boss, and then you just kind of chill until the next thing, right? If you're playing Fire Trap, it's get your Fire Trap on, make sure the flames are just putting a ground on them, like whatever it may be. All of these ailment and play styles are set it and forget it play styles, whereas Poison, while benefiting from a lot of the different ways that ailments really work in terms of their strengths, is still an uptime playstyle compared to the rest of these. And that's a part of why the ceiling for Poison just gets so high, because it's not actually a downtime built playstyle. You are expected to maintain and optimize your uptime. You just don't fall off a cliff when you have downtime, right? When you have downtime on a true hit build, you do no damage during your downtime, right? You do absolutely none if you have to step away from the boss and you're waiting and you're dodging stuff and whatnot. Like, you don't do any damage, where at least the poisons that you already had stacked up are, ticking down and running out while you're dodging. That's a part of what makes the poison strong. Now, this, of course, duration, all that stuff beats that out. There's this other piece that really keeps DoT so strong, and it's that they have done a lot of things over time to give us ways to make them stronger. And so now I'm going to fixate on the damage over time setups that have been pretty popular within the last year to really highlight some of the things that have changed to make them so strong. Number 1 in all categories here is the changes to hexes. Hexes, a couple leagues back, I cannot remember the exact number off the top of my head right now, they got a change to no longer have a penalty when applied to bosses. And this is very important because the marks, by and large, were pretty ineffective for damage over time playstyles. Assassin's Mark is a crit-oriented thing, not fantastic for damage over time. Poacher's Mark is flat fizz, which is pretty good for bleed and sometimes useful for poison, but vulnerability being stronger is just better for bleed, and despair being better is just better for poison. Then you had Warlord's Mark, which is just defensive utility, so it doesn't actually scale damage at all. And Alchemist Mark, which was just a whole ass miss on the way through. So instead, now our elemental curses and our despair and vulnerability just get stronger. Punishment, all of these hexes got stronger, which then really incentivizes the stacking of multiple curses on the target to just turbo shred their ability to survive damage. And I was going to say turbo shred their res, and then I remembered punishment doesn't actually reduce res at all. It just increases the damage they take when they're on low life, which, by the way, if you're not using punishment on non-wither oriented setups, you should try it. It is a really strong curse. Neither here nor there for this. It was just a thing that you should be aware of, that punishment is a really good way to really pump your damage in the faces when it matters on a boss. But you're stacking multiple of these curses together, right? You're playing Vortex characters, I think it was 319 or 320 when Jung played the Cold DoT Ascendant that did run Tri-Curse, right? It was Ellie Weak, Frostbite, and Punishment to just really crank damage through on the target, and you get to get away with trying to manage all of those debuffs because your damage over time. Once you've put your damage over time on the boss with good duration, your next focus is how many debuffs can I put on this member? How many buffs can I put on myself? Again, really utilizing the playstyle strengths to then scale the damage to a point where you don't actually suffer that much in most content on your downsides that you're supposed to inherit from being a damage over time playstyle. Now, we have to lean a little bit harder into some really specific things that make certain things even stronger. Ailments usually have an effect chance, right? You have to actually, either crit to guarantee it, at least in PoE 1. PoE 2 is confirmed to not have that anymore. Or you have to scale enough chance to apply the ailment. 100% poison chance, 100% bleed chance, 100% ignite chance. Even freeze, shock, sap, etc. all follow that rule. Not if you're an elementalist, though. Elementalist rework in 3 and 13 gave it the ability to just have guaranteed ignites on every hit. Alongside also the effect, what could be best described as a conflux effect, which is making all damage types contribute to a specific type of ailment. In this case, it's that all damage can't ignite. In other words, remember earlier when I mentioned that ignite only checks for fire damage? Again, not if you're an elementalist with Shaper of Flames taken. You now get to scale your ignite through several damage types, which has not meaning for various builds. Like DD, for example, didn't really care. DD ignite, that line doesn't do as much, but the guaranteed ignite chance does, because it means they don't have to go scale that. But if you think like Divine Ire ignite from the past, back when this first happened, or like Burning Arrow ignite again from when this first happened, or Fire Trap, or Wave of Conviction ignite, EK ignite, all of those really take use of the fact that you can scale so many more damage types. You can do things like play Wave of Conviction with obliterations and have the obliterations actually be a meaningful source of damage increase for the skill itself. And then also the pops from your obliteration, even though they're chaos damage, because all damage can ignite, the chaos damage from the pop will then ignite further, further proliferating the agenda of more damage across the screen. This is like another benefit that really does great work for ignite characters. And then now we have to go to poison, which poison has gone through quite a few different iterations of this thought that I'm about to drop on you here, right? One, the all damage can poison thing has happened in recent memory. One, the items like Volker's Guidance has always existed to give you alternative ways of accessing poison. There's also the boots from Eater himself to, I think it's called Indestructible Fate, which while stationary and 3 grasping vines, you can apply poison with all damage types. It was core to the recent gauntlet, I believe in 323, where they used those boots to apply poison on skills that otherwise wouldn't normally be able to apply poison. Or in 323, we also had access to tinctures for the poison caustic arrow. Well, caustic arrow of poison. I was going to say poison caustic arrow of poison. That sounds ridiculous. But caustic arrow of poison, but you're now scaling it with the tri-elemental bow as if you were playing lightning arrow, because you had the ability to apply all of that damage to your poisons through the tincture. Right? That stat is really strong. And the other thing about poison that makes it so strong is that it scales with speed. It is, in fact, the only damage over time to scale with speed. And if you want me to cover that in more detail, I can at some point in the future. This video is pretty long, and I don't want to make this one too much longer. But the general idea is that poison, why it ceilings out so far higher than everything else that you've heard about, is that it can scale with speed and duration. It scales with alternative stats. You've seen it like in my comment section. I saw it like talking about the melee video where melee needs more angles to scale. Everything needs more angles to scale. The more angles you have to scale a skill, the more ridiculous the skill's top end really gets. For example, Stormburst is a skill that most people don't really like mess around with, even though it's actually got a ridiculous damage ceiling due to the fact that not only does it scale with speed and a little bit of AoE and the regular damage and then phase conversion shenanigans, but it also scales on its duration, which increases its damage to another level. Same thing that made Spark really ridiculous. It's the same thing that makes Poison really ridiculous because, on the lower side, you're mostly just using Poison duration to kind of buy you some space in bossing, but on the top end, as you start to invest in it, it becomes very easy to turbo ramp your Poison damage to the point where the idea of a dot cap is almost a detriment to your existence. Although there's a really good explanation as to why dot cap is kind of fake, and it's specifically, just to give it to you here, that there are enemies in the game that take less damage, whether that be an Uber boss taking 70% less damage or Delirium going up to 96% less damage. The idea of dot cap is specific to how much damage an enemy can take from damage over time per minute. And therefore, if they have a less damage taken modifier on them, you can justify scaling your poison further, for example. This is a lot of words about damage over time, what makes it all so strong. So let me pull it all together and give you a little nice summary thought. The idea behind damage over time is that it is damage over time. It comes at a very high base to work with and gives you a lot of comfort in your playstyle because you do not have to force uptime in order to deal with threats. That is the core of what has made damage over time such a mainstay of the game. Again, the entire time, whether it be in the form of a spell dot skill, or maybe it just changes elements. Once upon a time, it was EDC, then it became cold dot, then it was fire dot, then it went back to cold dot, and the whole time ignite and poison are kind of like in there doing their thing. All forms of damage over time damage at some point has been good. Even bleed's had its time to shine, and bleed is doing pretty well right now, by the way. But you didn't hear that from me, right? Damage over time is strong because of its not needing 100% uptime. And the fact that a lot of its damage on the tree, anyways, for progression purposes, is very consolidated. So you get to then grab all of that very quickly, which is like a little small benefit. There's a whole lot more that can go into this topic. But again, like I said, I did not want this to be that long. It's just that damage over time is a hard topic to talk about quickly. Even if I were to split this up into just talking about spell dot and ailments, I would have still had two just 20 something minute long videos because it would have given me more space to dig into the nuances of each. And if you want to see that, or if you want to hear that from me, hey, look, maybe just like let me know in the comments, or stop by the Discord, which that link is in the description, and let me know, like, hey bro, talk some more about this. Or if you want to really connect, again, liking the video, subscribe to the channel and see more of what I do here, or Twitch. That is in the description. Might do some yaps about that on Twitch. Who knows? If you want to talk to me for real, though, I'm in Discord a lot. That link is in the description down below. Thank you guys for watching. And hopefully the next time I rant about ailments, maybe it might actually be finally the downfall of ailments. Maybe not. It probably will never happen, but who knows? Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.